Hello and welcome to another episode of the Monday Night Wars podcast. It is June 10th, 1996. And if you're a listener of the show, you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute, doesn't Scott normally do these intros? And you'd be right. You would be right. But Scott is taking care of a personal matter this week. It's totally fine. Nothing going on with him. I think he's dead for the week. And then next week he'll be alive again. So we'll go ahead and be back on schedule with that. But we were able to actually get a special guest host to help us out with this episode, which honestly was perfect timing for us. So today we have a guest who is from the Maximum Fun. I'd call it a podcasting network. Is that fair?
Sure, yeah, exactly right.
So today we have Julian Burrell from MaximumFun.org. And Julian produces Tights and Fights, a wrestling podcast that has been going on well longer than ours and is much more successful than ours. And he also edits Go Fact Yourself and the JV Club. Julian, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Why don't you tell us about yourself?
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm really glad that you pumped up the show as much more successful. I'm gonna have to remember that every single time that I'm feeling the grind of doing work as I always do. But yeah, I have we've been working on Tights and Fights for 7 years now, and I have to remind myself that 2 of those were during pandemic, where we probably were the most newsworthy show on the network, where we were constantly being like, oh well, this week we had crowds, oh this week we have no crowds, oh this week we have some extras that they just threw into the audience. It was just
Right.
We were tracking the wrestling reaction to the pandemic. Was a very weird time, but through it all, it's been very exciting. It's been a lot of fun working on every show on the Max Fun Network. I think they're not all wrestling based, but I think that they've all had at least all 3 of the shows that I've worked on have had at least one wrestler on them. So which is you can always tell my influence whenever one of them comes onto the show.
That's great. So what exactly does a producer do for a podcast?
Oh, a bunch of things. I think your role as a producer kind of evolves depending on which show you're working on. For Tights and Fights, it is generally I am soup to nuts, the person who is responsible for making the show a thing that is published every single week. Of course, my hosts are fantastic and they do their brilliant job of bringing the show to life every single week as well. But as far as, helping choose topics, as far as recording schedules, booking guests, editing the episodes, publishing them, doing a lot of publicity for them, that's all me. For Go Fact Yourself, I do a little bit less. That's handled by other people that work on the show. And then I mainly work on editing, making some editorial decisions here and there that I'm like, I don't think we should go in this direction if we want to do this, or, maybe helping out with topics and consulting on that front. The JV Club, because it had been going on for, I think, 4 years before I actually started working on it. I do almost even less there, even though Janet is fantastic to work with. And I'd work on that show for nothing because I love working with her so much. But yeah, so it's just mostly me editing it, helping her book guests, talking to her about stuff. It's a lot of things that I think it all just kind of, I've told people that your job as a producer kind of is a cross between being a babysitter and being a secretary, where you have to kind of be the one to set the rules about how things are going to work so that we can have a good night. But you also have to be okay, we're going to coordinate this schedule. And I think you have an opening here, so we can probably get something done there. It's a lot more logistics than you would think when you're involved in something that's supposed to be entertainment.
So essentially structuring the shows week to week.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So you do all the things that I and me and Scott have to do by ourselves. So what you're saying is we need to hire you as a producer so we don't have to do that stuff.
We are the magicians and the unseen masters of the world that make everything go. The unsung heroes.
Yeah, it's you talk about things like editing and stuff like that. Our podcast is very simple. It's very bare bones. It's all audio, and even though there's a lot of fun with it, there are some days where I'm just we usually will do them in batches. And sometimes I'll just set aside a day and be like, all right, all I'm doing today is editing. And the most infuriating thing, and just so the listeners know, we may go over our normal runtime. We've got a special guest, so just deal with it. We're gonna have fun. We're gonna get to know him and get to know his opinions. He actually hand chose this specific week. We gave him a list of weeks of kind of notable events, and he went for this one. So I can't wait to talk about it.
Oh yeah.
But we'll do the editing, and it's just the whole day you're going, okay, if we went an hour and 20, we got to pull 30 minutes off that and figure out where those 30 minutes are. And it's a lot of, do we make that point too many times? Get rid of it. Did we, are we just doing a run on sentence? Are we just rambling about nonsense? If it's funny, we'll keep it in. If it's not, just cut it. I think you'd be fair in saying that when you're presenting your host, as great of a job that they do, although they're not on the show, so they're not that important when we really think about it. We got the main man here.
Oh,
But
yeah. This is like, I didn't have the cachet of being a podcast producer that I did 5 years ago, of course.
yeah, and I'm sure there's been moments where you just look at what they're doing and you go, conversationally fine, but for the efforts of our show doesn't work. And so we got to find a way to make that. So interesting stuff. Really cool. Thank you so much for being on. As I said prior, we gave we gave Julian a list of weeks. One of them was the Scott Hall week, and I assumed that was gonna be the one that you jumped on, to be honest, because the big, the outsiders show up and all that. But you
Big deal.
specifically chose this week, so we're gonna stop dilly dallying and we're gonna go ahead and get right into it. As I said, it's June 10th, 1996. We are live from the Wheeling Civic Center in Wheeling, West Virginia. And I don't have an attendance number, unfortunately. I like to try to have that, but I don't have that. We do have the numbers for the length of matches for WCW, but they were not available for WWF. So when we get into that, listeners, if that's important to you, I'm sorry.
I have a
we
lot
don't
to
have
say
them.
about that. I really have something to say about that. That was, wow, what a journey I went through watching all this stuff.
Oh yeah. So one thing, I don't, on that note, and I may cut this, but I don't really watch modern wrestling right now. It's no,
Okay.
it is not a knock on anything that's going on in the world. I will watch the WWE pay-per-views, and I
Mhm.
know what's going on going into them because I do enjoy their pay-per-views right now. I think they're firing on all cylinders. I think
Mhm.
what Trips is doing is great.
Agreed, yeah.
And I actually got to listen to your podcast. I listened to Tights and Fights a few weeks. I listened to
Oh, much
specifically the
love.
King of the Ring episode
Oh,
and
yeah.
listening to
Yeah.
their opinions on going into that when they were just thinking about it. And it was interesting to hear some of their perspective because it felt like they were changing perspectives. I think one of the big ones is Nia Jax. Nia Jax, I feel like,
Yes.
has created this interesting character where a lot of the gripes that we as fans had about her are starting to slip away because we're starting to see substantial growth in her. And I remember going
Mhm.
into that pay-per-view and I turned to my wife and I said, I genuinely think Nia Jax should win this. And I listened to your guys' episode afterwards, and then she did. And I was like, this was the right call. This is exactly what should have happened.
Very
So,
agree.
what I'm rambling about to get into is that we, as the hosts of this podcast, we have to listen to or watch a bare minimum an episode of Nitro and an episode of Raw and whatever pay-per-views are along. So when it comes down to about 9 hours of content in a week, it's a little bit difficult to get the modern stuff going. So I'm
Oh,
sure this was
yeah.
a bit of a grind for you watching this. There's probably some fun, but when we get to Raw, listeners, it is, I'm gonna be real honest up front. It's not great.
No, it wasn't.
It's not
It
stellar.
See, that's the thing, is that I went through it, and I should also say that I have, I genuinely can't think of a time where I wasn't watching wrestling for that long. Like, there might have been, I think, like a moment in college where like I was just too busy and I didn't have access to like cable television to watch it, and I would just like, when WrestleMania came around, I made sure I paid attention to all that, and that
Right.
was, I think, when The Rock came back for his first match with John Cena. Pipe
Okay.
Bomb had just happened earlier that summer, and that kind of pulled me back in. But there was like a nice year-long gap where I was just like, I simply don't have time to keep up with this every
Right.
week. But other than that, I have been dyed in the wool, loved wrestling since I was a child, and including, I mainly was a WCW kid more than I was a WWF kid, even though I don't think I totally understood that there were two separate companies. I thought it was just wrestling, and it was
Yeah.
just like like, what am I gonna, like, the whole idea of them warring against each other wasn't super interesting to me as a 5-year-old. But I say all that to basically be like, I wasn't, because I think wrestling is a very nostalgic art. I feel like a lot of people always look back on it as like, oh, when I was a kid, it was this. Oh, when I was a kid, it was that. When I watched, mostly this feeling came up when I was watching Raw, but it also came up a little bit when I was watching Nitro. I was just struck by how much I enjoy modern wrestling more than like the stuff that was happening in the 90s. It just
Yeah.
feels like like I just feel like star power, athletically they're doing way better, and that's, that's how the art should be. People should always be standing on the shoulders of the people that came before them. But
Right.
I was just like, oh my goodness, do I appreciate like, Sami Zayn and Chad Gable putting on a classic on Raw versus like these two people who I don't like, who I'm not really sure got to do much more beyond this night. I was just like, who are they? Like, what are these people? What? Huh? What? Like,
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of that. It's interesting that you mentioned that in the nostalgia base, right? Obviously, that's kind of what the show is living on, right? Is the
right.
nostalgia of going through it. And we one of the reasons we wanted to do this is I don't think I could do a good job doing what you guys kind of do on Tights and Fights, which is basically go, let's look at what's happening right now and not necessarily judge it, but critique it, talk about it, go into it. I think I'd be way too reactionary for that.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one of the things that me and Scott really, really enjoy is storytelling, more so than the matches themselves. You're absolutely right when you say today's wrestling, the average wrestler is far more skilled in the ring than the average anybody that we're going to be talking about today, right? Yes, you
100%.
have your
Yes.
Flairs, you have, your Ricky Steamboats and stuff like that. Yeah, that's all great. Those are anomalies. Those are not the average person. And now you have these people who, we always call it flippy shit, right? They just do insane things. And
Hmm.
sometimes you look at it and go, maybe scale it back a little bit. You
Yes.
shouldn't do it so
Absolutely.
much.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons neither of us really watch AEW. And this is not an AEW hate thing. We're on board with AEW when they came out. I was actually blessed enough to be at the first show, the very
Oh
first Double or
wow. Cool.
Nothing. I was
Yeah.
there. I had so much fun. I've been to a few pay-per-views. Scott likes to say that Eric Bischoff is a net positive for wrestling. I think AEW is a net positive for wrestling. So this is not an AEW
Hmm.
bash session, but their storytelling right now is really kind of weak, and that's what
Hmm.
makes us lose interest. You can do all the interesting, crazy spots you want, but the story week to week doesn't make me want to keep going. I might go
Right.
into a pay-per-view if there's a dream match that I go, wow, I'd love to see Bryan Danielson against whomever, right?
Hmm.
Or Kazuchika Okada, when they got him, that was such a big moment, right?
Yep.
Those are great. And those I will be willing to once in a while pay a pay-per-view for, but the week to week product is difficult. So we wanted to kind of do this
Agreed.
show
Hmm.
because this show allows us to go, what we're judging. Number one, it's not going to hurt anybody's feelings because these people aren't doing it right now, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also, it's been talked about to an extent. People have kind of, come to conclusions. And what we found is actually some of the stuff that we like the most is stuff that people don't like and they aren't interested in.
Interesting.
One of the
Interesting.
big things has been Steven Regal. Not everyone loves William
Oh,
Regal, to be clear,
classic. Yeah.
but watching him on a week to week basis and be able to go like what this guy is doing in the ring is heads and tails better than really 99% of what people are doing today, and we're
Hmm.
talking about 30 years ago. That's impressive. So you do have the great athleticism, but there is some fun storytelling we're gonna get into. Not in WWF. There we're gonna have a lot
I'm
of complaints
just
about them.
gosh, I've got a lot to say about that, and I'm glad that you mentioned AEW. If there are any Tights and Fights listeners listening to this, like I love you guys. Like, don't worry, it's not personal. There was a time where when AEW first came out in 2019, 29.
Right,
Gosh, that
yeah,
was oh my goodness, that was so long ago.
right,
Um, when it first came out, I think people were very, very excited, and I understood that excitement, and I was on board with that excitement. There was this element of like, oh my gosh, we're living history right now. This is a new thing. We're forging new ground every single week. This is a new thing,
yeah,
and people were very excited about that. And I think that all of us on the show were generally pretty excited about it too. Some of us more than others, but we were like, oh wow, this is going to be interesting. This is like wrestling is about to explode in a way that we haven't seen in a while. And then over the course of the first few weeks, we were kind of the people that are like, this is a show that has some promise, but it's like it's got some pretty glaring issues on top of that
right.
that they don't seem like they want to address. It's like, why are the women not really getting that much time to wrestle? Why does it seem like so many of these characters are like kind of dissident from each other, and it's just kind of like scotch taped together, like they all barely interact with each other, and it just feels really weird. And now I feel like whenever we would express that on the air, oh my goodness, the
The
tweets
the
that we
the
were tagged
vitriol.
in, the emails that I would get were just, you would think that I told people that like you're an idiot if you like this wrestling. It was unbelievable to me.
Right, right.
But for the most part, I have like nowadays I feel like now that the newness has worn off, I feel like we're almost going in the other direction where people are like, it's cool to hate AEW more.
Yeah, I
So
mean, what you're talking about is the honeymoon effect, right? The honeymoon
right,
effect is over.
exactly.
And
100%.
and
Yes.
unfortunately, you brought up a really good point. It's become cool to hate AEW. We
Mhm.
try not to do that on the show. We criticize things.
Mhm.
Um, and I know you guys, the few episodes I've listened to, you guys are very good about being able to critique something without being,
Mhm.
dicks about it,
It's
to be
always
fair.
it's always coming from a place of love of like, even
Yeah,
if it is like the worst, most garbage thing I've ever seen on TV, generally speaking, I do believe, and I mean, like, this isn't even a bit, this is like, I do believe that for the most part, it does come all wrestling does come from something of a creative spark, even if it is like
right,
the most lowbrow garbage thing that you could have possibly seen. Like, I
right.
do believe that mostly speaking, somebody cared about what they are putting on TV, and that's why it makes me sad whenever I'm like, this is not good. Like, what on earth were these people doing? So it's
Yeah,
like, I think like, hey, let's meet in the middle. We can be honest about how we genuinely felt about something and not take it personally when people say it's terrible, and maybe not feel like we need to join in the dog pile and just be like, everybody, this thing sucks, and let's just, it's just, I think that there is something there, and maybe the internet is just not a good place like to do that
yeah,
sort of thing
yeah.
without a long form conversation like this.
I feel weekly that effect. My Twitter, for some reason, my Twitter thinks that I'm an old white Republican, which I don't know why. I don't know how that happened. But the other thing it knows is it does know I love sports, knows I love wrestling. So I get all the trending stuff, and usually when it's trending, it's not good. And unfortunately, every time it's something AEW, I find myself having to force myself to not respond to things because I'm
Hmm.
like, it's adding fuel to the fire that doesn't need
Hmm.
to happen, right?
Right.
Is AEW
Right.
in the best place I think they could be? Probably not. But you know what? A year from now, we could be talking about how they're the best company in the world and what they're
Yeah.
doing is great. We had that with WWE. When AEW came
Yes.
in, what happened was WWE was at an all time low creatively. It was a bad product. 2019 WWE,
Mm-hmm.
go back and watch that, and then, look at what you have now. And now we're singing its praises. And you know what? In a year, they could start making mistakes, and we could go, "This is a mistake." It's the
Hmm.
ebbs and flows of the wrestling business. No one bats 1,000. It's never gonna
Hmm.
happen. And when you
Yep.
can accept that and move on from that, I think you're in a much better spot. So
Yeah.
speaking of moving on, we're gonna go ahead and move into our next segment. Our first segment, actually. We open hour one with Tony Schiavone and Larry Zbyszko on commentary. They give the lineups for tonight and show us footage of Scott Hall last week and a tease for tonight's big surprise. We start the show with Booker T versus Scott Steiner. This is one of Scott's favorite things when they take two great tag teams and then they give them a singles match. Scott loves this. He adores this. It's his favorite thing. I'm not at all being sarcastic.
Hey, I
And
was thrilled to see Booker T. I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Right off the bat, one of my all-time favorites. Let's do this. And a very different-looking Scott Steiner, who that I genuinely cannot remember the last time I saw him as like, fresh out of the University of Michigan, Scott Steiner with like the black hair and
yeah.
the slightly different facial hair. I'm used to, bleached where are my freaks at Scott Steiner. Um, and that was a lot of fun to see. This was a very strange match, though.
My first note on this is actually WCW doesn't realize it yet, but this will be a big matchup for them in a few years. This is really a primer for, kind of the 98, 99 going into 2000. Zbyszko points out that Steiner is better on the mat, but Booker T can move and do a lot of high flying, which I thought was great from him. We find out that Fire and Ice and the Steiners had another double countout on WCW Saturday night. This is like the seventh time they've done that. And the Great American Bash will be a must win match between both teams. Essentially, no matter what happens, there must be a winner, which I think should be fun. Ultimately, Booker T goes for a splash that fails. Zbyszko says, "Nice swan dive that hit the jagged rocks below." Pretty good line. And Steiner hits a belly to belly for the win. It was a 5 minute and 54-second match. Julian, what are your thoughts on this opening segment?
I was very upset when Scott Steiner kicked out at 2 from the scissor kick, because that is like, as a kid, that was like a sacred move to me. I thought like, "Oh my gosh, he just kills people," even though it doesn't make any sense. They like, you kick them in the stomach and they have no choice but to sit there for 10 seconds while Booker bounces off the ropes and kicks them. It's weird. But as a kid, love that move. Still love it.
Yeah.
Still love that move whenever it's done correctly and they can find a cool way to use it. And I was just blown away that I was like, "Oh, I guess this is the finish." And that is there he goes. This massive shoulder shoots up, and I'm like, oh wow, okay. I guess they're gonna just keep going. Oh, Booker lost to a belly to belly. Okay, but overall, I just like I still liked it. I thought that you could tell there was something there. I like you say, I could easily have seen this as like in 5 years, this would be over the like a US title feud. These guys both went on to have pretty successful WWE careers as well. So it's like, it's really funny to see like these two guys um, who were very much at the beginning of their game still kind of have some star power because the crowd seemed like they were into everything that they were doing. And, seeing, I think it's Braun Breaker's uncle, right? Uncle Scott
Yes, yes.
is like, it was like, oh, wow, look at that. Like the athleticism and the genes are so strong here. My goodness.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I agree. I thought it was a very fun opener. I think so. You mentioned the scissors kick. At this time, this is not Booker T's finisher. They haven't figured out yet that that should be his finisher.
Right.
Right now, his finisher is the Houston Hangover, which is when he does the flipping leg drop, which is a great looking finisher.
Mm.
Absolutely horrible on the body, and I'm glad that he
Yeah.
moved away from it.
I was
I
like,
love
Booker, you're like 6'5". What are you doing, man? Like,
yeah.
take care of your back, man.
All right, so moving on, we can go into segment 2, where Arn talks smack in a pre-taped moment, and Jimmy Hart says he can't believe that Scott Norton is coming back for a double dose against the Giant. We come back from commercial, and Mean Gene is interviewing Scott Steiner about the Steiners' upcoming match. Steiner says that he and Rick pride themselves in being the #1 tag team, but is interrupted by Deborah McMichaels. She says she's sorry, but she has to talk to Mr. Okerlund. Scott says it's okay, because I guess that's a thing. She says she is
He's
upset
just
and
like, oh,
worried.
well, I don't get much TV time, lady, but sure,
Yeah,
fine.
right.
Like,
Yeah, I'll give it up. I'll give it up to you, who has done nothing so far in the wrestling business. She says she's upset and worried about her husband and that he might go crazy and hurt someone permanently. She thinks it's her fault. Mean Gene says it isn't, and she asks if they can make a meeting between them and the Four Horsemen to try and call it off tonight. Julian, what were your thoughts on this segment?
I was a little bit like lost on the drama of what was going on with the horsemen. I was like, okay, wait, so why are they upset? I didn't even know who this woman was at first. I had to look it up later. I'm like, okay. But I will say what strikes me more than anything is this is kind of like the beginning of what I didn't remember about WCW is that they are trusting Mean Gene to essentially be like the connective tissue to so much of this show. He is like running around everywhere. Whereas like nowadays with WWE and AEW, I feel like they rely on like a team of people to do that. They'll have like 3 or 4 backstage interviewers chasing people around to get their reactions to the thing. But Mean Gene's kind of like Mr. Do It All. They're like, interview her. Now you're going to move into the back. You're going to be trying to get a word while people are fighting. It's pretty impressive work from him.
Yeah, I thought it was a really good point you brought up of him being the connective tissue. I've never thought about it that way, but obviously you've got a producer's mindset, so you would think about these things.
Yeah, I'm like making sure that they keep. Wow, look at the way he kept them to time. Look at that Mean Gene.
Yeah.
What a pro.
That being said, I thought this was okay. Gave it a C. C's my kind of, yeah, okay, this was a segment and I'm fine with it. It was okay for what it was. So to catch you up, Steve McMichael and Deborah are obviously married, and Steve McMichael is upset that Flair keeps trying to steal his woman because that's a very Flair thing to do.
Oh my.
And so now
Art imitates life, imitates art.
yeah, now we have a tag team match set up for the Great American Bash between Steve Mongo McMichael and Kevin Green of the Carolina Panthers versus Ric
Yes,
Flair
I
and
forgot
Arn
about-
Anderson.
yes.
So that's what we're going into, and we will go back to that in a few segments. Moving on, we have our next match. It's Jim Powers versus Diamond Dallas Page. As Diamond Dallas Page comes to the ring, the crowd is starting to get behind him a little more each week. Jim Powers previously teamed with Paul Roma as the Young Stallions in WWF in the late 80s, and this was the height of his career. Overall, we got a pretty straightforward match. Powers gains control, but takes an elbow that leads to a diamond cutter for the 1-2-3. It's a 4-minute and 4-second match. Do you got any thoughts about this one?
DDP had some very green pants in this match. I was just like, oh my, I was like very distracted by everything that he was doing because I'm like, my goodness, like just the highlighters that he's wearing right now on his legs. But I DDP, it was fun to see him like, the original, I think probably the first version of the cutter that most people think of if they've been watching wrestling for a long time. And it's just, you could tell again, like a few years. I don't think he'd been the world heavyweight champion yet, but I remember
No.
DDP was a massive part of WCW's boom period. The Karl Malone stuff,
Mhm.
like he had like energy that I think people wanted to latch onto, which is kind of crazy because if you read his story, he was not like someone who got into wrestling as like a teenager or 20-year-old and then got into it. He was kind of like
I think he was
he had
35
right,
when he
yeah.
started, yeah.
He was like a Batista type of guy who got into it kind of later than most people do, but still found a lot of success. And to this day, I think over time he's just gotten more respected. And this is sort of fun to see the beginning of it. As far as the match goes, the giant highlighters for pants and seeing the diamond cutter, those are my favorite things. And I'm very binary with my reactions of like, yes, I liked it, no, I didn't.
Totally
So
fine.
because I feel like that's true wrestling fan stuff. You're either cheering or booing, right? So yeah, I'm gonna say that I did like this. I did like it a lot.
You guys heard it here first. Greatest match of all time, according to Julian.
Right.
If you're
Specifically
wondering
because of
for it,
those pants.
yeah. There's a lot of matches like this in Nitro. So this is the first. No, this isn't the first 2 hour. This is the second 2 hour episode of Nitro, I believe. So they're trying to figure out how to fill that extra hour. And the
Yeah.
smart thing they're doing is they're usually putting on like, okay, like we have two competent guys. Let's just have them have a match and then we'll see where it goes. You mentioned DDP and, he will eventually become the WCW World Heavyweight Champion. For about a year now, fans have booed DDP because he's been a dastardly heel. He's been a great heel. And they're starting to realize that they enjoy this guy, that they
Mhm.
love every time he's on TV. So we're starting to see that in the next few weeks. We'll see a little bit more each week. Moving on, we get a recap of Benoit and the Taskmaster and their rivalry.
This was such a jump scare to me. I was like, "Oh my god, what the hell?" Like anytime I see him on TV without like a warning or I'm just so used to him being an unperson for the
Yeah.
WWE, and it was just so crazy. I'm like, "What in the world? There he is. He's just a normal person like everybody else. This is weird, man."
Yeah, yeah. I think you guys have a joke on your podcast of redacted, right? When it's
Yes,
something that we
of
don't
like,
talk about anymore.
it
He's
does
very
become
much
one of those things.
he's very much a redacted individual. Not at this point yet. He hasn't done anything bad yet.
Yeah.
Kevin Sullivan is the lead booker and is booking himself front and center as much as he can get right now. They make sure to show Pillman quitting, undoubtedly due to the fact that he has signed with WWF and they're trying to discredit him. As we come from commercial, we have a Conan vignette reminding us that he is the WCW US Heavyweight Champion, followed by a Mean Gene interview with Conan. It will be Conan versus El Gato at the Great American Bash. Conan
Terrible
says
name. It's a terrible name.
Conan says Elgato will have to earn his respect in a short and to the point promo. I didn't have much thoughts on this. I gave it a C. What about you, Julian?
I didn't have much thoughts. I do like Conan a lot, underrated guy, especially on the microphone. I know he's got his own podcast now, and I think he endeared himself to a lot of people when he was doing Rey Mysterio's Hall of Fame speech, Hall of Fame induction
Mhm.
speech. I wasn't because I think it happened at formerly known as Staples Center, so I wasn't there for it, but we did see highlights the next day. And I think that kind of led me to going into like a little bit of a dive and like remembering what Conan was all about because I just remember playing as him in WCW NWO Revenge when I was a kid. But yeah, he's just like I'm glad that it's kind of cool to see him as a champion at that point. He was I kind of think of him as an underappreciated guy, but clearly they liked him enough to give him the title, right? So
I 100% agree. I also, this has nothing to do with wrestling. As an LA native, I appreciate the fact that you called it the Staples Center and not Crypto Arena.
it's such a mouthful. Just
Yeah, it's
like
like
it's
crypto.com arena. Ugh.
Yeah, far be it for me to stump for like, an office supply store, but Staples Center rolls right off the tongue. Crypto.com arena. Too many consonants. No.
I always feel like the Godfather when he's just like, look what they did to my boy.
Right.
This used to
Look
be
how they
the house
massacred
that
my
Kobe
boy.
built,
Yeah.
and now it's crypto.com arena. Anyways, moving on, we have our next match. It's Meng versus Sting. This is a very straightforward match, nothing really to write home about. Sting wins with the Scorpion Deathlock in a match that pushes no storylines. It's 3 minutes and 9 seconds. Any thoughts?
Sting is one of those guys who I've never totally been into. Not like I hated, like he was like a snore
Yeah,
to me. I just, when I've heard people talk about him as like, oh my gosh, he was like one of the top baby faces. He was like, and I can see the reactions he's getting don't lie, but I just like, I was always like this guy. Okay. But I did love him as the Crow, like everybody did.
right.
I just thought the visuals were really cool, like
Mhm.
like this Avenger like hanging up in the rafters. I thought was really, really awesome. But yeah, just he's kind of like a halfway point here where he's got the darker hair, so no bleach job, no he doesn't have the tassels anymore, but he's not clearly he doesn't have the motivation that the Crow Sting eventually did have. So it was kind of interesting to see like this as he's kind of, I think he might have, maybe I'd have to read like some stories about Sting, but maybe he's kind of like thinking his old shtick is kind of getting long in the tooth and he's trying to figure out where does he go from there, you know.
You are 100% correct in that assessment. This is
Okay.
in his career, this is the point where he is kind of rudderless. He doesn't really know what to do. It'll actually be Scott Hall who's the individual who goes, "Hey, you should watch The Crow. Like that's what we should be doing." And it's a obviously great legendary gimmick, and this is probably the worst point in his career to this point. That's not to downplay how great he still is. I obviously Sting's in like my top 10. I love Sting.
Sure.
So the fact that
I know he's a great guy. Yeah.
yeah, the fact that you don't have him there just makes that you're wrong. It's just that simple.
I'm used to that though.
Start writing angry letters to Tights and Fights.
Yeah. No. You can add that to like item B on your list of complaints if you want to talk to us about something.
But yeah, so this really is a point where he doesn't quite know what to do. And you're right? He's just having a very run-of-the-mill match. He's got insane athleticism. If you watch the Great American Bash, which is the pay-per-view coming up right after this and the following Sunday, he has a very throwback match with Lord Steven Regal, and it's phenomenal. It's a great match between both of them, especially from their character work in the ring. And you kind of have these moments where like every few months you'll see like, oh, that's the Sting that we remember, but between those you don't really get that. And then obviously we get into the Crow and it becomes this, I mean, he's still using the Crow, right? He's retired, but he shows up. He's never Surfer Sting anymore because there's never been a point in his career that was bigger than the Crow.
Visual is just forever, I think.
Oh
I
yeah,
think he could like be in his 70s and just decide he's gonna like pop up in the ring as the Crow one day, and I think it would still get a pop at this
so
point.
tomorrow
Yeah,
in
exactly.
the
Yeah, right.
70s.
He could just roll right out of bed. Don't even put the trench coat on. Just wear your pajamas and come over.
Could you imagine Crow Sting pajamas? It's like it's like a
Yes.
pajama trench coat.
Yeah. Like, let me wear a robe as I'm like, like, let me just pop up in the bathroom and just being like, yes, I'm here. Or let me just send downstairs as I'm trying not to make any noise. What I was thinking of as I was listening to, who was it with, who's Shivani's partner on commentary?
Larry Zbyszko.
Larry Zbyszko. Yes. What I was really struck by as I'm watching it is they are very heavily promoting the second hour. And now that you have told me that this was just like a very early 2-hour Nitro experiment, that makes a lot of sense. Because if you listen to the commentary, they're like, coming up in our second hour, our main event with this, that, and the other thing. And they're like pushing forward and reminding you, no, stick around for the second hour. Like, I think I honestly should have counted, but in the first like half an hour, I feel like I heard it 10 times or something. And now that I know that that was a new experiment, that makes complete sense. And I thought it was pretty smart too. And it's like, I feel like maybe this is because Eric, very much a TV guy, very much an always, lead into the next thing kind of guy. They cannot stop talking about, coming up at the Great American Bash, coming up at at our main event. It's good to know that like, oh, they were clearly thinking a lot about like, okay, let's not just tack the hour on and then just trust the audience. We need to tell them that this is something worth sticking around for twice as much time as you usually do.
Yeah. You mentioned that. It's interesting because in 95, they are so bad at letting you know when the pay-per-view is coming up. me and Scott, what we do is weekly, we get together and we just kind of watch. So we're like a year ahead of this. And there were so many weeks early on in WCW where we'd go to the next Nitro and then they'd be doing the replay footage of the pay-per-view that had just happened. And we're like, what? How did who no one told us? And then we'd have to go scramble and find the pay-per-view.
I'm just like, hope you joined us. It was fun. Anyway, here we go. Next thing.
Yeah. Moving on, we have Squire Dave Taylor talking at Hacksaw Jim Duggan, saying he will beat him with his own 2x4. Then Steven Regal says that he will beat another pathetic American wrestler, and he hopes the WCW fans can appreciate what he is doing for them, bringing class, dignity, and skill into their otherwise miserable lives. Great work from Steven Regal, in my opinion. Back from commercial, Mean Gene has set up a meeting between Bobby the Brain and Deborah. Deborah wants to meet Flair and Bobby obliges, but Mean Gene is pushed out of the locker room. As he walks away, Gene hears a scream from the locker room and Deborah runs out. Joe Gomez and the Renegade try to come to her aid, and the Horsemen clobber the hell out of them. Any thoughts on this segment?
It was good chaos, and I feel like what I did not totally appreciate is that I feel like this is something I would have seen a million times on any modern wrestling show now.
Yeah.
But when I look at when we can get to Raw later, but it's like when I looked at that, this feels like it was like just this must have been pretty interesting and innovative, because it's like Raw was a little bit of like a just so organized and structured, and so like this felt like, oh my gosh, this was supposed to happen. And I know we're not, WCW isn't in their bag as far as like, oh my god, these maniacs have taken control of the show and we
Right.
don't know what's
Right.
going to happen every week. But this is, you can kind of see like the little germs of it starting here, where they're like, let's just like start a fight and it doesn't have a conclusion. It happens and we have to try and move on with the show as best as we can, type of thing. Because a lot of wrestling shows are not just wrestling shows. They are like shows about a wrestling show where they are trying desperately to
Yeah.
keep it on the rails, type of thing. And I
Yeah.
think this is kind of the beginning of that. And seeing a very young Ric Flair will never not be weird to me. Like, I was like, oh, look at that guy. Look at him. Who would have ever thought all these other, everything that we know about him to this day?
Two interesting points that I think you brought up there. One is the structure of WWF, right? At this time, and this will be a recurring theme in Vince McMahon's tenure that seemed to never end until it finally did, where he was always structured to a fault.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the few times that he would allow that structure to go away is really when they thrived. And this is kind of the problem that WWF has. They have no idea that they are a week away from 83 weeks. We're not there yet,
Yeah.
but they
Yeah.
are a week away from that.
I noticed that as well. I was like, "Oh wow, look at that!" Like the streak started right after this week. So what we'll get
Yep.
to in the final segment was clearly something that moved the needle, and it,
Yeah. Yeah.
boy, did it ever.
And their structure hurts them. It hurts them for about a good year and a half.
Hmm.
And they finally, I think there's a moment where Vince actually finally comes out and basically says, I'm sorry to the fans, and we're going to try to
Yes.
be better. And it's a historic moment. And they play it
Yes.
up like this game-changing moment. It really wasn't. It's
This was
just
the.
it's
I
them
just
accepting they are dumb.
I just remember like 2010 Domino's Pizza came out with these commercials that were basically like, "Hey, we suck, but we won't for long." That's what that felt like. It was very much like, "Hey, all that stuff we did, boy, that sucked. Keep watching." Like, uh,
Right. The other thing is that Arn and Flair have been able to cook for weeks. This has been a fun ride. You mentioned that this is kind of the germs of the NWO starting and things like that. Obviously, they will not participate in that, but kind of the idea of these backstage segments.
mhm.
The thing that I think works the best here is that we don't know what happened to Deborah. So we are forced to tune in the next week. If that is important to us, if the storyline is important to us, we have to tune in and find out what exactly happened in that locker room. And it will play into the pay-per-view, which is again great booking from their standpoint. Moving on, we have our next match. As said before, Squire Dave Taylor is taking on Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Dave Taylor pushes around his servant Jeeves, and we get word that that we have a team willing to wrestle in place of Joe Gomez and the Renegade, who were just attacked by Flair and Anderson. The new team is Lex Luger and Sting. Sting will pull double duty in a tag team title match. Hacksaw and Dave Taylor don't have the same chemistry that Hacksaw and Regal had, and Hacksaw wins in a 2-minute and 25-minute match with a taped up fist. What are your thoughts, Julian?
This felt so very 80s, just as far as like oh well, like this guy who's just a big character, and clearly like is a guy who there's a lot of like wrestlers as like, I have a job but I am also a wrestler of like the 80s, and
Yes.
this is like the dying gasp of that. And it was interesting seeing this, because it's like I've read a lot about what Eric Bischoff was thinking about certain things as far as presentation, and he was very against doing like the kind of cartoony WWF style of the time. And I'm just like, it's like, wow, like maybe he was just like, hey, I know these guys still have some star power. Jim Duggan, you can put him in a 3-minute match and it's harmless. And so maybe we'll keep people tuning in for that. So And also the finish, very, very weird. The taped up fist thing. I was like, wait, so like, what is that supposed to? And I heard them be like, he made it so that his fist was basically as hard as a rock. I'm like, sure. Like,
Yeah.
like I guess I'll buy it. Like, I don't know, but
Yeah, the taped up fist has always been confusing to us. We don't know. Scott is a mega Hacksaw fan, so it's a good thing that he is not here today. Loves Hacksaw.
he
Um,
seems like a nice guy. And
he
I know
is.
people love him. I love him.
He
I
is.
know people love him so much.
He's somebody who in this era, like you mentioned, right? He is kind of a product of a bygone era, but there are moments that he gets in this kind of year to two run where you go, oh, that really worked well, and they just never knew how to recapture it. So moving on from that, we have a vignette on the cruiserweight division that teases Dean Malenko versus some upstart named Rey Mysterio Jr. at the Great
Yeah.
American
What'll
Bash.
he go on to do?
Yeah, nothing. He won't be important. Followed by a backstage interview with Mean Gene, who speaks to Big Bubba and Jimmy Hart about Bubba cutting Shark's hair, and that Shark is now John Tenta. Jimmy Hart says that Tenta didn't pull his own weight in the Dungeon of Doom, and Bubba says that Tenta is only half a man and that he will beat him at the Great American Bash. I gave this a C. I don't think it's necessarily a great promo, but it didn't overstay its welcome. What did you think?
Right. Yeah, it was very much like a whatever kind of promo. And that's like, I forgot how many of these like little things they like to pepper throughout the show. I know that kind of do that now on most shows. It feels less of a like a clear your job is to pump up the match and more of like a priority was clear, like fill up the time, get in there and get out. And I don't know. I just it feels different. There's something. It's a different flavor of what we'll see a lot today.
Yeah, you're not wrong. We've talked about certain things that they've made mistakes on, especially in the last few weeks. One of the big ones, and I think we'll have it here today as well, is the Hulk Hogan vignettes while he's gone. In
That
in
was weird.
today's in
So
today's
weird.
day and age, we would never do that, right?
Yeah,
I used last week Roman Reigns as the example. Roman
exactly.
Reigns has been gone. Let him stay gone. So when he comes back, it is a holy crap moment. It's the birth of television, essentially.
Yeah, just like this idea of like, hey guys, he still works here. Like it was very, very like, and maybe I know that the whole Hogan is the third man thing didn't come together until supposedly. I don't. This is Carney's talking, so I don't like. You never know exactly
Yeah.
what's real, but supposedly that didn't come together until they were very close to to Bash of the Beach. In a way, maybe it was accidental. It does kind of like work in the favor of like, oh, remember Hulk Hogan? Can't you just can't wait for him to come back, can you? Like it's gonna be so great whenever he finally comes back. And then
Right.
it's like a big turn when it's like it was even more shocking to everybody who was there that like, but you promised that he was it's like the betrayal was fresh, I feel like seeing him being reminded of him constantly probably made that heel turn even worse than like even a harder hit than it would have been if he just was completely gone.
Yeah, it's a good point. Moving on, we have Mean Gene who interviews Scott Flash Norton, who they've been calling Fire as Fire and Ice. How was Flash Fire not the name that they went with?
Yes,
Whatever.
would have been a lot better.
Anyways, Norton says that the Giant is trying to end everyone's career. He says he took the choke slam not once but twice, and it's because he doesn't care and he's not scared. Then heads to the ring for his match as we count down to hour number 2. Speaking of this match, it's him versus the Giant, and Eric Bischoff and Bobby the Brain Heenan take over on commentary. Bischoff reads a list of men that the Giant chokeslam, which I could not be bothered to write down.
It was a murderer's row as far as
Yeah.
like I was like, oh wow, let's look at that. Like the Giant slash the Big Show was like,
Yeah.
man, oh man, they were really pushing this guy, and I don't blame them. Like, I mean, he was obviously an attraction. The appeal of look at this gigantic person who nobody can possibly beat is just a tale as old as time in wrestling, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Speaking of the match, Giant immediately takes to Norton, who turns it around and goes for a three repeated corner splashes. The third receives a big boot. Outside the ring, Norton tries a corner splash onto the Giant and hits the ring post instead as the Giant moves out of the way. Norton eats a choke slam outside and gets rolled in the ring for the 1-2-3. It's a 1 minute and 42-minute match. He goes to beat up on Norton, but Lex Luger comes out for the save. Giant beats up Luger and goes for the chokeslam through the table like we saw a few weeks ago. Luger kicks Giant in his Jolly Greens and gets away to the announcer table. Luger grabs a mic and says, I guess the Giant does feel pain. One for me and one for you. Julian, what are your thoughts on this?
Man, it's just such a like it's like, aha, every man has his weakness if you just kick them in the nuts and run away. It's like honestly, I just like keep going back to the Giants last the Big Show. I think like we were just at the beginning of them wanting to showcase a more athletic type of wrestling, the cruiserweights and everything, but I just like the Big Show. I feel like if we saw somebody of his size, I know people would be a little bit annoyed that we were seeing like a 3 minute match or whatever. But it's like Brock Lesnar made like a 5 year Renaissance career recently, where that was his big appeal, was just like he would come out and kill whoever he was in the ring with. And as mad as people got, like it's hard for me to say that it ruined the box office and the appeal of a Brock Lesnar match, because it's like you can do those little matches and then build that up to, oh, but when he's going to fight somebody who can actually fight back, oh my God,
Right.
we finally get to see that. Like, it's going to be incredible because we finally get to see him get pick on someone your own size, kind of thing.
Right.
And so clearly this was meant to be like to kind of give Big Show something to do and an excuse for Lex Luger to look like a hero, which I can appreciate. I don't know. I just keep going back to that. It's like interesting. The more things change, right? The more that they kind of stay the same in wrestling.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's storytelling. That's what it is. The point is to piss you off as the audience and have this
Mhm.
feeling of it will never ever change until it finally does.
Yes. Yes.
Moving on to our next match, we have Billy Kidman in his Nitro debut versus Lord Steven Regal. Steven Regal bullies Kidman and wins in 57 seconds after Kidman misses a 450 splash. Regal hits a double underhook suplex, followed by a modified crab similar to the Lion Tamer for the submission win. Sting attacks Regal, who has cheap shotted him week in and week out, and talks smack for about the last 2 weeks. My grade on this was a B plus. I actually, even though it's very short, I thoroughly enjoyed this, but I am interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Oh, it's gonna be like I can't say anything bad about William Regal. I've always thought like I just even when he is like asked to do like the most goofball, like you see it like towards the end of this when his legs are shaking and he's got like he's mugging really hard for the camera and stuff. There's just something like about I don't know his like his commitment that I've always appreciated. Like he's got the technicality down. That's why he's like such a great trainer and such a great coach for a lot of different people, but it is just like every single time that he is asked to do something, he is going to put his foot in it. And it is like, you can see it here too, just a total pro. Like, I know that there's no, like, it's such an obvious, like, oh, we're going to take this guy with the British accent and we're going to like turn you into a snooty British man who comes down to the ring every day. But it's just, it works. It's just, he's so good at it. He plays the role so well.
We've often said that his character work is unparalleled. If you were to look up, if you're a young aspiring wrestler, he is one of the guys that you should be looking at, because it's not just his character work on the mic, it's his character work in the ring. It's every single thing that he does enhances not just the match, but his animosity towards and from the fans and everything he does. We could do a whole 2 hour bit on Regal and
Yes,
how much we
yes,
love
we
him.
have talked about him so many times on Tights and Fights. He is just a wealth of things that I can appreciate as far as his career is concerned.
Absolutely. Moving on, we have the Nasty Boys, who have been off Nitro for quite a few weeks since their feud with Public Enemy ended. And they are against the Public Enemy, because of course they are. This has been going off and on for a few months, and some say they're still fighting to this very day. This is an 11-minute and 30-second match, and there isn't really anything to talk about on my end. This has been the same match we've seen with these two teams every single week. I'm going to go ahead and just, how did you feel about this? This is the
I
first time you've watched it.
It was the first time I've watched it, and I was blown away by how much time they were getting, considering the crowd did not seem that into it, and they are trying their best to like wave their arms around and get them to like to pop for something. But it just kind of felt like they were. Now that I know that it was like the millionth time that they've seen it recently, it kind of makes sense that they'd be like, yeah, all right, go on ahead and get this over with, because it's also like it's something of like I think is this the last segment before we get to like the final match of the night?
Let's see. No, we've got a few other things that happen, but we're pretty close. We are very
Because it's
close
like
to it.
this is that lull, like this is like maybe it's the growing pains that come with expanding and getting more time, right? You have to figure out that fine line between how do we take the audience on a journey, but also keep them interested, but naturally like let them relax so that they're not exhausted when the big thing comes up. So I'll just chalk it up to growing pains of like switching over to a 2 hour format.
One interesting thing that did happen during the match was that we got the 8 millionth Glacier promo, or vignette rather. This has been happening for weeks. It'll continue to happen, and it never ends. So there we go.
Just enjoy those promos because that is about the best thing that'll come out of them. Because
Yes. Poor Glacier, really good dude to my understanding.
Mhm.
Um, we move on, and obviously we talked about this race. We're not going to go into it in long form, but we talked about Hulk Hogan's vignette. We move on from the vignette and we go back to seeing Kevin Green and Steve Mongum and Michael working out with their new coach, Macho Man Randy Savage. Mach says, "This isn't football. This is wrestling. You got to learn the ropes. You can't be too intense and you can't be too great." What'd you think about this, Julia?
Come on, it's Macho Man. What am I gonna say something bad about it? No, of course not. You give him like you let him just sit there and talk for like 15 minutes. And I'm like, that is 15 minutes of television well spent, in my opinion. Like, just come on.
Yeah.
And I will also say, because I was watching this a lot of this on Peacock, and it's funny that they kept a lot of the ads of the time intact.
Oh
Like
yeah.
there's an
Oh yeah.
ad right in the middle for the WCW magazine. I was like, oh wow, they just kept this in there, didn't they? That's amazing. And it's like I'll also say it now for like on WWF, they were like Sega Saturn presents the Slam of the Week, and I was like, whoa, oh my gosh, I haven't heard that like the Sega Saturn just mentioned as like a thing that was buying ad time. That's amazing. It's like I
I
appreciate that little pieces
I
of the time.
I often think about products that I either don't know what they are or I know what they are, but the only reason they're important to me is because the amount of ads that were run on like WWF growing up. Like Castrol GTX,
Yep.
I think it has to do with cars. That's about all I
Yep.
know. Uh,
Bodman fragrance spray. Like, God,
Podman
that's
was great. Stacker 2, I remember Stacker 2.
oh
I have no
yes.
idea what Stacker 2 was. It was some sort of supplement. I'm gonna do air quotes on that. I'm
Yeah.
sure it was probably a little more mischievous than that.
Right.
Moving on, we have our main event of Lex Luger and Sting versus the two horsemen, Flair and Anderson, accompanied by their Flairum. In what is the longest match of the night at 18 minutes 34 seconds, Lex and Sting defeat the two horsemen in a fun and action-filled match by DQ when Giant interferes. Steiner helps Luger as he, Luger, and Sting fight off the Giant. Mean Gene interviews the Giant, who says no rules at the Great American Bash. Bring whatever you want to, but I promise you, you're going out on a stretcher. What are your thoughts on this?
Crowd loved it. It's just like
Yep.
the star power in that ring was just at another level. To pretty much everything else on the show, I think. Like it's just, I mean, I think that it's a little weird that like the Giant wasn't out there that long ago, and then he just ran back, and then he ran back out to the ring. It's just a little weird. But it's still, that's fine. I'm sure that in today's world, what they probably would have done was put the Giant early on, even if it was closing out the first hour, and then bring him out for the closing of the second hour. But
Right.
maybe they're also thinking we need to really load up the second hour again, because it's like we need people to have a reason to come here. And if we put the World Heavyweight Championship there at the end of the first hour, nobody's going to want it. They'll be like, oh, I saw the champion. What else is there to see? I love seeing these guys kind of in their heyday, because I know like there is an element of always with wrestling of like, are they hanging on too long? Are they like, why are they like, do we really need them to stick around as much as they are? But it's a good reminder that like that once upon a time, people freaking love these guys. And there's a
Yeah.
way you
Yeah.
kind of like see if there's anything left for them to like, maybe even if they're just going out there for a thank you, it's like you find the right way to use them later on in their life because people freaking loved them.
Yeah. I always think that John Cena is the best example of that I've ever seen in my life.
Mm.
Everyone when he first came was like, whatever, became Thugonomics John Cena. Everyone loved him. I don't care who you are. No
Mhm.
one can tell me they didn't love Thugonomics John Cena.
Yes.
Everybody
Yeah.
was hot for that. He wins the US title. It turns into a spinner belt. We all loved it. He finally wins the championship, I think against JBL, and
Yep.
he turns that into
Yep.
a spinner belt. We all loved it. And then a year or so goes by and we realize he's no longer Thugonomics. Now he's kind of, very straight, and hustle, loyalty, and respect. And all of a sudden we all start hating him.
Yep.
And we hate him for a long time. And then
I
all of a
blame
sudden
the Marine movie personally.
I saw that in theaters. Do you know?
Oh,
that?
wow. Nice. I rented it, and it was we've talked about the Marine saga many times on Tights and Fights, and it is like I'm just amazed at them finding ways to be like Die Hard, but with a guy who wants to get his girlfriend back, and they are just like, hey, do it again, but this time they're in a building. This time they're in Seattle for some reason. It's just man, oh man, was WWE Studios, they were really trying, weren't they?
Oh, yeah. But you look at his career, and now he is someone that kinda anytime people talk about him, it is with reverence and respect, and people appreciate him. Because yeah, people go through ebbs and flows in their career, but there'll be a ability to have a longevity of 20 years
Mhm.
and entertain fans. At a certain point, you have to look at it and go, "Maybe I should stop hating this guy, and maybe I should start respecting what he's done for
Yep.
us." So anyways, one of the other things I did want to talk about is you mentioned loading up the second hour. That's a really astute observation. Part of the reason is that second hour is uncontested. There is no
Oh
Raw
yeah.
second
Yeah.
hour. So they
Yep.
get to go, we're going to put decent, quick filler matches that you maybe won't tune in for, maybe some bits here and there, but that second hour, we're going to load up. And when you turn the channel, it's going to make you want to come back the next week. Moving on, Bobby Heenan loses his mind on Bischoff, saying he doesn't want to be touched or bothered by Macho Man Randy Savage when he realizes something in the distance and runs. It's Scott Hall. Bischoff says he doesn't want any trouble, but he has to point out there is no big surprise. Hall points behind Bischoff, who turns around and is face to face with formerly Diesel, now Kevin Nash. Nash
Mhm.
grabs the microphone. He says, "You've been sitting here for," I have no Nash impression, so it's not going to happen. He says, "You've been sitting here for 6 months running your mouth. This is where the big boys play, huh? Look at the adjective, play. We aren't
Big.
here to
Oh,
play."
wait, no, right, right, play. Stupid Kevin Nash doesn't know what an adjective is.
We aren't here to play. Now he said last week that he was going to bring somebody out here. I'm here. You still don't have your three people. You know why? Because nobody wants to face us. This show is about as interesting. I don't know who the name
This
is that he
line,
says here. I
yeah,
Let me
I'll
be
tell you, I'll
clear.
give you some. Like,
Okay,
this was an amazing line. I was like, "What in the how come nobody has ever told me about this?"
if you know who this individual is, please let me know because I've looked it up. I tried to use subtitles on Peacock, and it literally said inaudible. I believe he says I believe he says, "This show is about as interesting as Mark Shot."
So I actually did look up who Marge Schott is. It turns out that she was a baseball executive who was very old in the 90s, but was also a huge racist and a Nazi, which is why she ended up having to sell her shares of the Cincinnati Reds, I believe. Very, very weird. Still pretty strange that Nash would invoke her name.
This show is about as interesting as Marge Shot reading excerpts from Mein Kampf, which is what a
What?
great line.
Of all the things, that would not be boring. I mean, it'd be a lot of things, but it wouldn't be boring.
Yeah,
What
potentially
in the
controversial, could potentially,
yeah. It
but yeah, boring
disgusting,
probably
morally
wouldn't.
bankrupt, but boring, absolutely not.
We literally had a president for 4 years who just kind of flirted with that line. So,
Right. Yeah. That was like the networks didn't think he was boring of all the things that you could say about him.
my lord. Bischoff says he wants no trouble. Nash says, "Yeah, no trouble because you know I'll kick your teeth down your throat. Where are your three guys?" You couldn't get a couple. I love this line. You couldn't get a couple paleontologists to get a couple of these fossils cleared.
That
You
was
ain't got.
pretty
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Nash was clearly in his bag. I love it so
Oh
much.
yeah, you ain't got enough guys off the dialysis machine to get a team.
Yeah.
Where's Hogan out doing another episode of Blunder in Paradise? Where's the Macho Man, huh? Doing some Slim Jim commercial? Hey, we're here. You want to say something? Bischoff says he doesn't have the authority, but he will go to Atlanta and try to get them their fight. He says maybe at the Great American Bash, he'll let them know. They agree, and Kevin Nash gives one of his best lines, which he's already had some great ones, but the measuring stick just changed around here, buddy. You're looking at it. I think it goes without saying that this is an A. However,
Mm.
you specifically chose this week and specifically because of this promo. So I am very interested to hear your thoughts on this whole thing.
I mean, it lives forever, doesn't it? It's just one of those things where it's like, I mean, nowadays somebody shows up in wrestling and it's cool. Like, it's cool to see, like, whenever somebody jumps from, WWE to AEW and vice versa, but this was, like, felt like it was almost breaking the rules and conventions of what wrestling was supposed to be. Like, we're so used to, like, there's, like, a very segmented way that wrestling is presented, and there's this is supposed to happen, but whenever you get this moment of, like, what are they like, he can't do that, can he? Like, and it's just the beginning of, like, that, and I think it's interesting when you watch the crowd, there's not this element of "Holy shit, it's Kevin Nash." I don't know if I can curse, is that okay?
Oh, absolutely, go for it, yeah.
Okay. Like, it's just like that this element of, "Holy shit, that's Kevin Nash." I think people are kinda like, you see them kinda murmuring, it's like, what is going on? Like, are we still live on the air? Like, is this on TV? Like, what's
Yeah.
going on? Like, there's something very cool about that, and I don't think it's possible to do that very much anymore, because we're all just, we know so much and at the same time so little, but it's like, I don't know, I will always, like, think about this as the beginning of something very, very crazy in terms of, like, of the wool being pulled over our eyes in a way that we had not ever expected to be pulled over before. And I never knew who Diesel was. I never knew Diesel whatsoever. I
Well,
knew
that's
him as
interesting.
Kevin Nash,
Yeah.
100%. He was Kevin Nash to me as a kid. I didn't know who Diesel was until I, like, started getting into, like, watching archive matches, and, like, the network came around and I started watching a little bit more of that. But then I watched, like, the rise and fall of WCW DVD, and I saw that Kevin Nash had a great career as Diesel in WWF at the time. So I'm sure for a lot of people, like, when they're not doing, like, "And please welcome to the ring, oh my goodness, it's Kevin Nash," there was an element of, like, what, like, is, like, what is this? Like, it's special. It's very, very special.
You talked about obviously this being a moment in time, being special, being groundbreaking, all those things. You look at wrestling as a product today, whether it's WWE, AEW, does not matter. The surprise return or surprise debut got created here. It really did. I mean, not necessarily this specific segment, but WCW, I
Mhm.
think, can be attributed to that. Their first Nitro had Luger show up. He
Luger
was
showing
just
up
on
at
Raw.
Mall of America. Yeah.
Yeah. They have the whole debut 2 weeks prior to this where he gives a great promo. Now they've got the Nash. This this created that element of when you see it, there's a reason to get hyped. It's something that we kinda take for granted these days.
Mhm.
Now when it happens, sure, we're excited, but we don't look back and go, where why am I excited about this beyond the
Mhm.
fact that I know this name? And it's absolutely fantastic. One of the things that you mentioned was Kevin Nash is in his bag, and I think that is not only a great observation, but also we saw for the last few weeks of his time in WWF. We watched the first 95. Diesel is bored. You can tell. He doesn't he It's not that he doesn't wanna be there, but you can tell he's just kinda spinning his wheels, and there's a moment,
Mhm.
and I can't remember the exact week, but we've talked about it. There's a moment where he has given his notice, and he does two of the best things in his career, in my opinion. The first one is he loses Shawn Michaels' first title defense, and they have a banger match where he and Shawn just go out and they just really tear the house down. It's a phenomenal match. The other thing he does is because he clearly does not care and he knows he's leaving, he just starts relaxing on the mic, which he had never done before, and starts doing things like this. So the in his bad comment is really good because he's kind of been piecing that together on his way out the door. And it's really funny because you actually see for the last like 2 months, you see Kevin Nash as Diesel instead of it being Diesel. And WWF never gets to profit off that. He
Nope.
goes to WCW and now he's Kevin Nash fully. And we've talked about before Kevin Nash, when Kevin Nash is calm and not just screaming and stuff like that, so good on the mic. He can weave
Right.
these insane references. The balls to bring up Mein Kampf is
It's just I'm sure they got letters of, like, "Hey, can you pull that back a little bit next
yeah,
week," or something from the
yeah.
network.
But wonderful stuff. But that is the end of our night for WCW, but it's not the end of our night as far as this podcast goes, because now we got to move on to what I'm sure is the absolute winner of your week,
Oh my
WWF
goodness
Raw.
gracious. What on earth? Like, I've just, like, it's easy to minimize WCW's impact on the business of wrestling because of how it kind of fizzled in the end. It's easy to minimize the NWO, Scott Hall, Nash, and Hollywood Hulk Hogan because of how the NWO kind of fizzled towards the end. But one thing that you simply cannot deny is, and I think that people need to remember, is that WCW was literally the biggest company in the world
Mhm.
for a period of time. They
Yeah.
completely ate WWF's lunch. It was not even close. It's when I was watching Nitro, I was like, this feels like a very outside of the last hour or the last 15 minutes, this feels like a very standard wrestling show. It doesn't feel amazing. It just feels like a very standard show. But you don't fully appreciate it until you turn on what was happening on Raw at the time. And you're just like, what in the world were these people doing? Like it was just ripe for somebody to come in and just completely like and say, like, no, this sucks. Let's do it better. And that's why, like, I mean, even AEW, now the company that gets compared most to WCW, even when they were at their best, AEW didn't completely dominate WWE to the point that it was like adapt or die
Yeah.
the way that WCW did. And I think that is just like that. There's this comparison is great because you will appreciate, like, oh no, WWF in a lot of ways was lucky to still be in business by the
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
by the time this 3 year period of head to head work is done. It's really really fun to see.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You brought up a really good comparison with the AEW stuff. The reason that, to me, that WWE, at now WWE, didn't have the adapt or die mentality is because they had done this before.
Mhm.
And they knew when it finally got to a point where it was absolutely bad, we're not gonna wait until we're losing money. We're
Mhm.
gonna change now. And they started to kind of weave a web that really kind of worked and produced. And you have AEW really at this point on their heels trying to figure, I mean, they are throwing so much at
Mhm.
the wall and hoping something sticks and it's not working. Again, not bashing them. I hope they have continued success. I hope
Mhm.
I hope that they are always around.
Yeah.
But they're kind of doing the same thing that really WWF is doing at this point in 96. Not as bad, not nearly as bad. I will
Yeah.
say that. So save your letters. We
But
don't
it's
think
also,
they,
you can put it as a positive, like, with WWF, I know that they weren't doing very well. It clearly wasn't the roster's fault. Like, I know that they were like, I was watching the show and I was like, even though this is not good, like, look at this. There's Mick Foley in his
Mhm.
prime. There's The
Yeah,
Undertaker in his prime. There's Shawn Michaels in his prime. Owen Hart, all these guys who so talented. It just needed a radical change in direction for them to say, okay, like, how do we present these? How do we really do this right? Like, how do we move away from what we've done and grow and change? Because to grow, you have to change, right? And I think
absolutely.
they finally decided that that was what they were going to do. And I think it's all it takes is Tony Khan waking up one day and saying, like, you know what, we're gonna do things different. We're gonna
Yeah,
finally, like, I'm gonna sit down. I'm gonna work with my best people, and I'm gonna figure out how do we get here, what do we need to do to get to another level? And I think
yeah,
that that's like that. It took a lot. Like I said, you don't want to do it to the point where you're like on your heels and you're desperate for something.
yeah.
But I think that conversation is important to have in any business.
So let's get into it. It's still June 10th, it's still 1996, and we are now at the Cumberland County Memorial Auditorium, such a mouthful, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Our first segment, we jump right into a match. It's a King of the Ring qualifying match between Yokozuna and Owen Hart with Jim Cornette. We tease a presentation from Jerry Lawler. Oh, fuck, I forgot about this. We tease a presentation from Jerry Lawler to the Ultimate Warrior later on in the night. It's a painting that Lawler made of Warrior, and he says it's worth $100,000. Owen wastes no time in attacking Yokozuna, but the advantage barely lasts as Yokozuna begins controlling the match. Less than a minute into the match, and Yokozuna is using the ropes to hold himself up. Yoko goes for a bonsai bomb and just randomly falls off the ropes. No one does anything. He just falls.
Yeah.
Owen uses the ropes for leverage and a pin and the win. What'd you think of this, Julian?
I mean, it's just I absolutely love Owen, an
Yeah.
absolute genius of wrestling. One thing I'm very happy about with AEW is that his Widow kind of gets a sense of closure. She gets to kind of continue the legacy in a way that she's more comfortable doing, clearly, because
Right.
I think there's just too much baggage between her and WWF because of,
And
understandably,
fairly,
because of
yeah.
how everything happened. I don't blame her whatsoever.
Right.
But I love him. I love seeing him right here. This is kind of before he really takes off, but I think this was after he'd won the King of the Ring, so he was the King of Hearts for a little while,
Right.
right?
Right.
So it's just like he's got the cast and he's doing just like very cowardly heel stuff. It's so, like, compared to the Bret comparisons are obvious, but like the stoicism and like of Bret Hart is just such a great contrast to Owen being such a snivelly, like, yeah, my arm hurts, you know?
I think so we always joke that Owen is the king of hearts. We think that he is by far the best of the hearts. It's no offense to anybody. I'm not a Bret Hart guy. I'm not attacking him. It's not a Bret Hart guy, but
Mhm.
we really believe that Owen is the best and was
Yeah.
the things I mean, it's almost like he's WWF Steven Regal. Everything
Yes.
he does is for something. His character work is impeccable, and he works his ass off to make this match work. In my opinion, the match still does not work. I
No,
gave
it
this an
doesn't.
F,
No.
not a fan of
It's
it.
I'm focusing on Owen because that was the thing that made me happy in this. I should be perfectly clear. And this is the King of the Ring tournament that Steve Austin ended up winning. So it was kind
Right,
of fun to see. Like, we only see the ending of that and the behind the scenes stuff of Triple H was supposed to win, but
yeah,
Vince decided that he was mad at him. And yeah, it's just like, hey, you'll never be in this family, son. But no, it's just it's kind of fun to see like the whole journey of how we're gonna get to the birth of Austin 316, even though Austin's not really on this show at all. It's just like there was a
right,
lot going on at the time before he
right.
took off.
Yeah, and unfortunately for Yokozuna had a great beginning of his career. I think that's very well documented, and unfortunately, we're just at a point where, for whatever the reason is, he is insanely unhealthy and seemingly will not work on that, and it just unfortunately gets worse and worse. But let's try to stay on the positives, which unfortunately this show does not give us a lot of. Let's go into our next segment where we get a teaser from another first round matchup between Mark Marrow and Skip from the Body Donnas, as
Oh
well
boy.
as well as the already teased Lawler and Warrior bit, and a matchup later between British Bulldog and The Undertaker. We then see highlights from last night at Horizon rather, in Chicago, Illinois. This is a tease of their live audience show tours and a kind of a transition into an ad for the Attitude Adjustment tour.
Which I did not know. That has to be like where John Cena, when he changed the name of his finisher from the FU to the Attitude Adjustment, the double A. I was like, oh, is this what, like, was he just like, researching old WWE like lore and was just like, oh, the Attitude Adjustment, that could be a good one, you know?
It absolutely could, and, it's possible because people don't give Cena enough credit for this, but that dude is absolutely a wrestling historian.
Yes,
Every time
loves it so
every time he
much.
talks about it, him and Cody Rhodes, I think, are the 2 where it's just like the references they bring, I'm constantly impressed by. I'm like, "I had no idea about that," and I feel like I know a pretty decent amount about wrestling.
Yep.
Moving on, we have an interview from the Action Zone where Jake the Snake says that his wife would have to shake him awake because he wouldn't be breathing. This is not funny. I shouldn't be laughing about this. And would often be choking on vomit due to his alcoholism. Before we go into the next bit, how do you feel about them turning his alcoholism
Oh,
into a
I hate it.
storyline?
I hate it so much. I hated it. I was just like the in WWE with Triple H at the head of this does this a little bit less now. At least I haven't seen them do it so far. But this is something Vince loved to do. Whenever he
Yeah.
found out one of his guys was an alcoholic or had a pill problem, he was like, you know what? What if we make that into part of your character? No, that's terrible. Like, would you like, we think now in the real Hollywood world, we think it's in poor taste whenever you give an alcoholic a character where they are an alcoholic. That is the
Mhm.
worst environment you could possibly put somebody who has an addiction problem in. So it
Yeah.
is just terrible to me, like, just baffling that they would think this will be great. People will really sympathize with you by the end of this. It's terrible. And
Yeah.
I think the other thing that makes it even worse is Vince, I mean, before the concussions and the steroids ruined his brain, clearly, he was a decent commentator. He at least called the action.
Mhm.
Jerry Lawler, in the middle of all this, is not the person you want dealing with something like this with the sensitivity that it deserves. It is awful hearing him laughing at his own jokes constantly for just like the dumbest things. And I'm like, what? And he's like, hey, hi, I heard your wife. Like, you got to introduce me to your wife sometime. It's just so bad. I'm just oh my God, it's so just like, I don't know what, like, we get off on a bad note just because of like Lawler being on commentary and just like being so grating for so long. Like,
You absolutely mesh well with this show because I about once a week, I will go on a rant about Jerry Lawler and how much I despise him. I'm not going to this
no.
time because you've done it for me. I will
Decent
say
artist, though. That was a good portrait. I'll give
yes,
him
he is a
that.
good artist. He's good in the ring, he's a good artist, should never be on commentary, and I never wanna meet him. That being said, I think the realism of storylines can work, not in the version of alcoholism or drug
Mhm,
addiction.
mhm. Agreed.
When I remember quite a few years ago, people made a big deal. I wanna say the storyline was, Charlotte Flair versus Paige, now Soraya. I think
Mhm,
Paige brought up the fact that Charlotte's, brother had passed away as a
mhm.
heel move. And people really lost their mind about it in a negative way, saying that's absolutely reprehensible. You should never do that. Blah blah. I disagree. I personally think if it's done tastefully, you can do it. It's a great heel move to absolutely be like, I'm going to bring. I mean, look. Christian Cage does it weekly about people's
Constantly. That's his
dads,
whole gimmick. Yes.
and it works. It works so well. So it depends on the performer. The one time I
Agreed.
think I've ever seen the alcoholism thing work, the only time was CM Punk and Chris Jericho. And the
Mhm.
reason it worked to me was because CM Punk was not an alcoholic. Chris Jericho's inference was basically, you have that in your blood. So I guarantee you, if I gave you a bottle, it would happen. And
Mhm.
even though that's very, very touchy, you had to have two of the best performers in wrestling history to pull it off. And they did. That
Right.
is the only exception, I think, to this
Mhm.
rule. I
Yes.
think, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
I'm a fan of, like, blurring the lines and, like,
Yeah.
finding ways to touch. I don't think, like, wrestling is art, right? As goofy as it may be, it is still
Right.
art, and it shouldn't be precluded from touching on things the same way any other art form shouldn't be precluded from touching on things. It's just when you have Vince McMahon, who is an absolute maniac, and he's not going to be there to, like, give them sensitivity training to be, or, like, sitting down and really thinking about, "Okay, how do we do this?"
Yeah.
And wrestlers are in the mentality often of like, what if hey, if it got a reaction, who cares, right? It's
Yeah.
just they don't like it's hard to know where your line is. And I think like you have to have people who are like willing to communicate behind the scenes and to like talk about, okay, what do we touch on, what's okay, what's not okay. I think that's when you can do this effectively, is when you have people who are like, we know how to do this the right way so that nobody's feelings are going to be hurt, that we can like, hash it out and everything. And I
Yeah.
think that that's perfectly okay. It's just Jerry Lawler's not that guy, unfortunately.
I just think it's wild that you're trying to create this narrative that Vince won't put his arm around your shoulder and say, "Hey, bud, how can we work on this together?" All right,
Yes.
moving on from this horribleness, we go to a backstage segment where Jim Ross interviews Yokozuna, who says that Yokozuna can't believe that he lost to Owen Hart and that this isn't the old Yoko and that he can't concentrate and needs to go find himself. Any thoughts on this?
Solid promo. I felt like
Yeah.
this would have very understated, didn't go on too long. I thought
Yes.
that this would have been right at home, with a vet losing a match that they expected to win today.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I'm not really sure where Yokozuna went from here, but that was pretty good work. I mean, that
I mean,
bloodline acting ability,
yeah,
right?
didn't they kinda do this recently with AJ Styles? I feel like they kinda
Yep,
did a similar thing with him. That kinda
right.
became his gimmick where it's like he can't win the big one anymore. He's
Mhm,
too far gone, and now they're doing the the Mark Henry thing, which I don't hate, but we'll see how it goes.
right.
Moving on to our next King of the Ring qualifier match between Mark Marrow, who has Sable with him, and Skip of the Body Donnas. WWF is presented by Got Milk, and Jerry says that Sable
Oh,
isn't pretty. He says this weekly. I don't know why he does it. Jake the Snake points out that facing Marrow, one should keep the match on the mat due to Marrow's athletic ability, which I think is a great commentary from Jake, who has joined us on commentary. Jerry keeps trying to make jokes about Jake's inability to be a high flyer. And I love this. Jake is just like, yeah, that's true. Like, what do you want from me?
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
I'm not a high flyer. Marrow
I
blocks
was
a
almost like,
Frankenstein.
why just get Jake on the mic on commentary for the entire show? Why is Lawler? I know it was his job, blah blah blah, but like I'm like,
Yeah.
You have one person who's just obsessed with being a clown and
Yeah,
one person who's actually watching the match. So it's like,
yeah.
who am I gonna want on commentary?
100%. They do this a few weeks where, like, anytime they don't have Jerry, it's a great time. Like, they'll have Doc Hendricks. He's been on commentary a few times, and I'm thoroughly surprised by how great he is on it. Jake the Snake, they've done it with Mr. Perfect, who obviously was still wanting to wrestle. That's a whole thing. We don't need to get into that. But anytime it's not Jerry, it's usually a good time. Mero blocks a Frankensteiner off the top rope, but Skip takes back control with a clothesline, and Mero ultimately delivers a Frankensteiner of his own for the victory. I gave this a C. I thought it was an okay match. Julian, do you have any thoughts on this?
I thought it was okay. It just went on far too long. Like I would have to look it up, but I'm pretty sure that this was the longest match of the night. And it's just Mark. I know that Mark Marrow's Wild Man Mark Marrow thing was like he very much like his story ends up being that he gets overshadowed by Sable. Everybody
Yeah.
wants to see Sable over him. And I'm like, yeah, 100%. I get it because he is such a like, this feels like such a Vince gimmick of like, you're a crazy person of like, you just like, you get your eyes really wide and look wild. And I'm just like, the whole time I'm looking at it, I'm just like, this does not feel like a natural performance. This feels like somebody who was like in the back, just kind of like, what does a crazy person do? What does a wild man do? Just like very big expressions and stuff. It just feels so like it just feels like I'm acting, like I like he doesn't understand quite how to like find something and make it natural. So he's
Yeah.
just going big, and it's like whenever you don't know what to do, go big, so you can
Yeah.
at least like go into that. Like his decisions is like that, and he doesn't know how like the art of subtlety. It's just very,
Mhm.
very weird. And I had no idea who Skip whatever his name was. What was his name? Skip.
Skip of the Body Donnas. Who is do you know Chris Candido?
I do not know.
Oh, okay, so Chris Candido, big indie guy, wrestled in TNA for a while, ECW.
Okay.
This is his unfortunate run in WWF, and it's
Okay.
they even had a Dark Side of the Ring episode about him recently.
Huh.
Yeah, not great. I mean,
Again, star power, just it's
yeah,
not there with like you compare the star power of WCW to the star power of WWF in this first like 30 minutes. Not
oh
happening.
yeah.
There's no comparison.
Absolutely. So moving on, we've got a few ads, which I'm going to skip for time. And Vince McMahon is in the ring to interview Jerry Lawler and the Ultimate Warrior. Warrior gets gassed the minute he runs out there. WWF has piped in ecstatic crowd noise, but the live crowd is clearly dead. Jerry says he saved Warrior a lot of trouble by helping him get eliminated from the King of the Ring because heavy hangs the crown. He says that Warrior's new comic book is fantastic. It's not, with great art, and that as an artist, he made a portrait of the Warrior for the Warrior. Vince says Jerry is just trying to get out of the match. Warrior replies by saying, "You may be an artist, but I see you as the biggest con artist there ever was." Absolutely obliterated him with that comment. Ultimate Warrior goes on to say, "I can appreciate the art and the time it took to make, but there is this just goes off the rails, guys. But there is only one king in the WWF, be it at King of the Ring,
Ah,
WrestleMania, Survivor
ah,
Series,
where? What?
SummerSlam. The battleground doesn't matter. Right here, Warrior points at his hat, created by a destiny. Will feeling a destiny bonded by a belief that at King of the Ring, I'm going to kick your ass." That is the actual transcript, everybody. I
I
don't
was
know
just
what he said.
king. There was a king. I'm a warrior from the start. It's very purely Ultimate Warrior right here. I just mm.
I gave this an F plus, and the plus is because the artwork is actually nice that
Yeah.
Jerry made. That's
This
all
is
I gave it.
I have a few things here.
Sure.
I hear Vince saying anything can happen here in the WWF a lot, but nothing is happening on the WWF. I'm just like, what? Then make something happen. Like this
Yeah.
is bad. The other thing is, I read that Ultimate Warrior wearing a hat, very weird. But apparently, according to Lawler's book, when they do the spot of him getting bashed over the back of the head with the glass, Warrior was like, "Oh, I don't want glass in my face or something," so he wanted the hat to protect him, which is still weird. Like even me, who's not like a big Ultimate Warrior guy, I was like, "What in the world what is that?"
From
Um,
a safety issue, I'll give that one a pass.
yeah, and then I don't know, like it's just funny to me to like see him because he's never worn a hat before, and he
Yeah,
just comes out
absolutely.
wearing a hat. But I will say this segment's not good. the crowd did wake up when they saw the Warrior. Clearly there is like he still has some good grace with the crowd, doing the sprint. Him getting hit over the head is weird. It's hilarious because he gets hit over the head. He does that thing of like no selling that the Warrior was
Yeah.
very famous for, just like shaking it off. And then he just sprints to the back for some reason, and they don't really know what to do with it, because then it's like he does, it's like literally he gets hit, shakes it off, and runs to the back.
Yeah.
Like he just like it triggered a memory or something, and he had to go like remember that he left something in the oven. And I'm just like, and it's just the weirdest thing, because then you see Lawler and Vince, to their credit, trying their best to like be like, hey, he probably had to go, and like he probably ran away, and it's something, and it's like they didn't even know what to make of it. It was really very strange. Yeah, like I'm not a huge World Ultimate Warrior fan. This does not endear me to Ultimate Warrior, unfortunately.
Moving on, we have a recap at what happened between British Bulldog and HBK, and then at King of the Ring, we get a rematch to finish the fight. Then we get a replay of what we just saw, which I don't know why you would replay that. And finally, we have our main event. We have the Bulldog versus Undertaker. Bulldog has his wife in Diana Hart with him, as well as kind of his eye candy in Owen Hart. Undertaker has his wife in eye candy, but they're both Paul Bearer. HBK is in studio and says he's looking forward to doing what he does best. He feels that he let down the Clique, which is his term for the fans, even though we obviously know that as a different term nowadays. in
Wink,
the
wink.
in the first match between him and Davey Boy, Jim Cornette takes the mic to talk to HBK and says, how did it feel to get beat by Bulldog and listen to them play his music before Monsoon saved him? HBK says he won't get into it with Cornette. He does say Vin Man knows what the belt means to him, and he thought his life was taken away for a second. Then Cornette says, I know something you don't know. He says that Clarence Mason's lawsuit against Monsoon has been settled out of court, and that Monsoon agreed to let Cornette and Mason pick a special referee for the rematch between HBK and Bulldog. HBK is understandably upset, and Cornette says he hasn't seen the half of it. This has all seemingly happened, by the way, during The Undertaker's entrance, which is kind of
Right.
actually believable.
I was wondering what was going on. I was like, I just hear gong, every like the gong, gong. I'm like, are they just like standing in the ring waiting for them to finish talking? Thing about with Shawn Michaels, I'll say a few things. First of all, very, very handsome. I was like, oh wow, okay, I get it. Like I understand why this guy, like, how did you not like figure out you can make money with this dude?
Yeah.
But the second thing that I like was the thing of just them just going on for so long, and you're just hearing the Undertaker's music in the background, and I had to, like, I wasn't really sure what they were doing. I was like, I felt like I needed like, red string on the walls to like follow what the talking points were and what they were trying to do, because it's just, even Sean sounded like he was like doing his best. Like Sean's a decent actor and a good performer. So it's just like, he's like, I'm buying that he's very concerned about something, but I just don't get what they're freaking out about and why it took so long for them to get to the point. Like a really weird segment. Very, very weird. I wanted to just go on ahead and get to the match. I was really tempted to fast forward, but I didn't.
There's so many moments like that when we watch these, specifically from WWF. Speaking
Mm-hmm.
of the match, we're going to go ahead and get into it. Cornette refers to Diana as the flower of the South. Diana's from Canada, so is the South Iceland? What? Okay.
Like the south of the North American.
Cornette is upset that Monsoon booked Taker against Bulldog and is impressed by Taker's old school move, which is fair. He's elated as Bulldog hits a monster suplex against Taker, and then the stunned Taker does his sit-up spot. We cut to commercial after a Davey Boy power slam. When we come back, Vince confirms that Monsoon is allowing the ref to be decided by Cornette and Clarence Mason. Bulldog keeps taking it to Taker, who keeps sitting up and fighting back. Cornette says he already has the ref lined up, to Vin Man's surprise. Taker goes for a tombstone that Bulldog reverses into an Oklahoma slam that Taker also counters. Then they start swinging until Taker knocks down Bulldog. Cornette suggests that Taker has a foreign object in his glove as we go back to commercial. Coming back from commercial, Jim Ross plugs the WWF Superstar Hotline. Has Brian Pillman joined the WWF? Yes is the answer. We come back to the match, and Taker is in control and chokeslams Bulldog, then clotheslines him out of the ring for some reason. Bulldog gets thrown into the steps, and Taker gets counted out when he can't make it back to the ring because Mankind is actually holding Taker's foot. Bulldog and Mankind attack Taker as Cornette pulls Bulldog away from Mankind, who he deems far too crazy. Mankind hits a pile driver on Taker and wants to hit a mandible claw, but refs won't let him as the show fades to black. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, it's just night and day from the last thing where you're building up to something. This is like, honestly, I feel like the dips that WWE was in that we talked about in recent years,
Mhm.
like you can see the Vince-isms right here when he wasn't like listening to people to tell him to do things better. It's just like, what was this conclusion? It just kind of ended. Like it's just like if we don't know what's going to lead to what's going to happen next week. What's going to happen? Like, why should we care about these guys? Who knows? Like, it just doesn't matter. Like the show happened and then it went off the air.
Right.
It's just a very, very, and it's like I'm also just very bummed out because it's like I'm not a huge Undertaker fan, but I appreciate that like there was a theatricality there that I think a lot of people really got into, and it's like
Mhm.
Mick Foley, a big theatrical guy. So it's like you would expect when you're putting the two of them in the ring that something crazy is going to happen with these monsters
Mhm.
getting their hands on each other, and it's just they don't go. This is oddly a situation where they don't go big enough. It's just like
Yeah.
they should have
Yeah.
been absolutely like brawling through the crowd or like fighting into the backstage, and they don't like, and then they announce that they're going to find a way to settle this or something. I don't know.
Mhm.
They're just, but it's just very strange that it's just this is going to happen. This is going to happen, and then we're going to fade it back. That's the end of the show. We don't know what's
Yeah.
going to happen. Who cares?
Yeah. I will say this is the only segment I think of the show that I enjoyed, that I felt like was actually doing something. I gave
Mhm.
this an A minus. I think your criticisms are absolutely warranted. To your point with the Mankind Undertaker stuff, they will eventually kind of go into a very fun rivalry. So we're just right
Yes.
around the
Yes.
corner there, but they haven't quite started. Mankind's been teasing it. They've kind of started and stopped this rivalry a few times, but we're about there, which is great.
Mhm.
So that is the end of the show. I'm gonna assume here that you absolutely think that Raw won the night.
Oh, absolutely. I can't wait for, to see just a bunch of random things happening on a show and then to be like, "Hey, and that's all, folks." No, I just like it's so like painfully obvious that like I know Bischoff was not a wrestling guy. Bischoff
Right.
was a TV guy. And I think that that expertise absolutely came into play. I think,
Mhm,
you know, uh, he understands how to hook an audience. He understands how to get people interested in making sure that they tune in every single week, how they stay tuned for a full 2 hours. And maybe honestly, now that I think about it, I'm kind of sorting this out in my head as I say it. It feels like the problems that bookers run into is that they have a very successful period. They stop listening to other people tell them how to do things a different way. And then that's when the problems start coming up and when you run into danger. That's what happened with Vince at this point. Bischoff, that was still a year and a half off before that kind of happened to him.
mhm.
And it just like it's clear that it's just you need perspective. You need a new perspective every once in a
Yeah.
while. Somebody to tell you there's a better way to do this than what you're doing it. And yeah, I'm looking forward I want to see some more Nitro. I like knowing that this is going to keep happening. I've like the road to what happens with Hulk Hogan and everything, how everything just as crazy as Nash walking out there feels, it just gets even crazier when Hogan comes out there and they're just like they set a new standard for like we are going to absolutely run roughshod and you have no idea what is going to happen every single week.
We've joked about it, but the best way we can sum it up is WWF says every week, "You never know what's gonna happen in the WWF."
Mhm.
And in
Mhm.
WCW, you actually don't know what's gonna happen in WCW. They never
Yeah.
have to say it, they just do it.
Yep.
So, clearly, we both agree that Nitro absolutely won the match, which goes into
Yes.
our final segment where we find out were the fans right or wrong on this week, and, they were surprisingly absolutely batshit crazy. Raw got a 2.7 in their Nielsen rating, and Nitro got a 2.6. But as we said, this is the final week of Nitro losing for 83 weeks. And they start that historic run next week after the pay per view, going into Monday, June 17th, 1996. This has been an extra special and super long, and we apologize for that episode. Julian, I apologize for wasting your day.
Hey, no problem. This is fun.
That being said, anything you want to plug before we sign out?
You can go listen to the podcast that I work on for Max Fun, the JV Club with Janet Varney, interviews with great creative people every single week about their years in high school. You can go listen to Go Fact Yourself, a trivia game show where we welcome on guests to talk about things that they love that have nothing to do with what they do for a living. And we pair them up with great experts that had a direct influence on the thing that they love. That includes people that were into Star Wars. We paired them up with the person who played C-3PO.
Nice.
Lots of different stuff. It's always a fun show. We always get surprised every single week. It's a lot of fun, and I work very hard on it. Then you can also listen to It's Extra Relevant if you're listening to this show. Is Tights and Fights, weekly look at wrestling. We often laugh about it a lot. We often have opinions about it a lot, but it's all from a place of love. It's all from a place of care. And you can join us every single week. We have, I think, coming up, what'll be extra relevant because we touched on him a lot, is an episode about Owen Hart
Oh,
and Bret Hart and that final kind of run from Bret Hart turning heel at against Stone Cold Steve Austin, leading up to his ignominious exit from WWF later on that year. So we have a really fun guest for that one, and I think it was a very, very good show.
that's fantastic. You can find all those podcasts, I believe, on everywhere you can find podcasts. I know
Yes,
for sure you
indeed.
can find it on Spotify. I've listened to quite a few episodes now of Tights and Fights. I'm a little jealous because of how well it's produced, but of course, we have the man, the myth, the legend, Julian Burrell. Thank you
No,
so
don't be
much for
jealous. It's a
joining
great
us, sir.
show. This is a great show. Yeah, don't be jealous of me. You got your own great show, and it's your baby, and you should be proud of your baby. I like it. I've had a lot of fun here today.
Awesome. Julian, thank you again. And that's it for us. Bye, guys.
See ya.